Well, I'm currently working as associate professor in the Suleman Dawood School of Business. And prior to this, I have worked as a consultant with various international organizations. And prior to that, I used to work with the government. Uh, and I started my professional career as a civil servant in 1990. And I worked in the civil service for about 9 years. And then I spent several years working with NGOs. So I have a very varied professional background. And I consider myself to be very fortunate in the sense that I have first-hand experience of working in the government, in the non-profit sector, and now in the academia, and also working as the consultant. Well, I've been working with LUMS for the last 6 years now. Prior to that, I have worked as adjunct faculty with two good universities in Australia, Melbourne. So that association would also span over about 2 years. So, in terms of paid work for some academic institution, it's about 8 years. But then my association with academia dates back to, I guess, now 25, 26 years, because I've been studying, I've been, uh, doing guest lectures, I've been doing seminars, syndicates, and all that. So, like my professional background, my research interests are also very varied. And I'm primarily interested in looking at the legal and institutional frameworks for service delivery in various areas. So my focus areas are health, education, and agriculture. So in all these three areas, what I essentially do is that I examine a particular small item or policy issue, and then look at the legal and institutional frameworks which either enable or impede service delivery in that area. So far I have worked on various issues of education policy, I have worked on various issues of agricultural policy, and I have also worked on various areas of health policy. But in all these three areas, my focus invariably has been legal and institutional frameworks. I'm currently teaching 4 courses, and I enjoy all these 4 courses. My most favorite is, I guess, uh, a 400 level course that I do in social policy. This is called Modern Thought in Social Policy. It's a lot of social theory, and this course discusses some of the key philosophers of the 20th century insofar as their thought has impacted social policy and practice during 20th century and 21st century. So in the course of teaching this course, I have myself got to study a lot, and I have myself learned a lot. So that's my favorite course. In my opinion, both success and failure do not come in lumps. So they are small steps. So you fail um, in several ways, and similarly you succeed in several ways. So I was awarded the Best Teacher Award in 2016. So that was a recognition of my work and as a teacher. And I think uh, at least for some students, I have been able to inspire them to think critically on various policy issues. So I would consider that to be a success. That's not a big thing, but that's one of the small things that I consider to be important in my life. So I have long-standing history of working for NGOs, with NGOs. I have myself set up several NGOs. I'm currently on the board of several NGOs. So my association with NGOs actually dates back to 1984. So that was the time when I first set up an NGO. And throughout all these years, I have been intrigued by the relationship of NGOs with state. So it's not a smooth relationship. So NGOs interact with state at various levels. So their first interaction with the state is when they opt for registration. And for an organization to start working as an NGO, it's not necessary for them to be registered. So they can be an unregistered organization, but then there will be problems in opening a bank account and raising finances. So for small scale activities, grassroots organizations generally will not opt for registration. But if you want to scale up, if you want to move beyond the funding of your family and friends, and you want to collect funding from various other sources, so then you have to open bank accounts, then you have to go for funding campaigns, and that obviously requires the organization to be registered. So that is the first relationship of the NGO and the state. But as I kept on dealing with NGOs and setting up NGOs, I realized that that is not only the first interaction between the state and the NGOs, but it's in several cases also the last one. Because very frankly, once the NGO has been registered, NGO has no incentive to go back to the government because government is not providing them anything. And government on its part does have some interest in knowing what the NGO is doing, but it doesn't have the capacity to do that. So the first interaction in most cases also becomes the last interaction. So that was the starting point when I started, thinking about this issue, and I thought that it should be interesting to look at the relationship of state and NGOs in terms of the legal requirements which various NGOs as registered entity, so they have to fulfill. So then I started looking at various laws and I examined them in detail and also examined what are some of these steps which then become bottlenecks as far as registration is concerned, and then also looked at state's capacity. So from that starting point, the paper continued to expand, and so ultimately I was able to then mount an argument that the relationship of state and NGO is that of strangers. So although the relationship of state and NGO should be that of collaborators, of partners, because both are pursuing social development and both are deeply interested in and engaged with the task of uplifting the lot of the common man. So if the mandate is the same, if both are pursuing the same objective, then it makes a lot of sense for both these parties, that is the state and the NGOs, to work in unison, work together, and that is what happens in most countries. But in Pakistan, the relationship is that of complete, strangers. So that's why I gave it the title Perfect Strangers. So there are two reasons for that. One is that since my own research, as I explained earlier, focuses on legal and institutional frameworks. So that is my area of expertise, and that emanates primarily from my experience of being a civil servant and having worked with the government. So I think my understanding of the government is slightly better than other people because I have been part of the government in key policy and implementation positions for several years. So that enables me to then look at the regulatory frameworks in a different context. So I have been part of the regulatory process, and then as an employee or a director or a founder of various NGOs, I have also been on the receiving end of the regulatory process. So I thought that it should be interesting to examine that. And the second reason for focusing on the regulatory aspect of the relationship between state and NGO was that that's the primary relationship that the state establishes with the NGO. So if the state interacts with the NGOs, so how will the state do that? So that is through regulation. If state wants to support the NGOs, if state wants to know more about the NGOs, if state wants to nudge the activity of the NGOs in a particular direction, if the state wants the NGOs to maintain certain type of standards, so all of these things then have to be enshrined in the regulatory framework. So basically the laws under which the NGOs are registered, and also then the institutions which are tasked with the responsibility of implementing the various provisions of these laws. So that these were the two reasons which led me to focus on the regulatory framework to examine the relationship between the state and the NGOs. So, it's basically for the state to play a more proactive role. As far as the NGOs are concerned, so in my view, they are small, medium, or large scale setups to uh, carry forward the mandate of the state itself. So, in modern times, it's unreasonable to expect from the state to meet all the requirements of its citizens, and there are several of these. And over a period of time, as more and more things become uh, areas of interest for society at large. So, in social policy terms, we call these as states of dependency. So, basically, those states when individuals are dependent on the support of others. So, these could be either in the form of early childhood, or these could be in the form of old age, or these could be in the form of some sort of disability, mental, physical. These could be in the sort of some sort of a trauma or a dip in your personal and professional life that you face. So these are the stages, these are the states when, as individuals, we are dependent on the support of others. In recent years, more so since the Second World War, so there has been a general consensus globally that these states of dependency are no longer the individual responsibility, they are also the responsibility of the society at large. So if it's the responsibility of the society to help people when they are vulnerable, when they are dependent, when they need the support of others, so it's responsibility of not only the state, but it's also the responsibility of uh, groups of people who come together or who organize themselves in the form of NGOs to help those people who are in a state of dependency and who need societal help. So, in that sense, the NGOs are furthering some of the social policy objectives of the state itself. And there is some sort of support that the NGOs would want from the government. That support could be in the form of some sort of concessions in terms of tax incentives, in terms of certain reliefs on maybe electricity tariffs or whatever, or loans or concessional loans or outright grants. So these are some some examples of the support that the NGOs would welcome from the government. But in a sense, the NGOs want an environment from the government in which they can operate freely. They can, if they are a rights-based organization, then they can critique the functioning of the state. They can raise their voice uh, in support of those people whose rights have been violated by the state. So more than anything else, more than concessions, more than grants, more than loans, or more than uh, uh, any other direct form of support, what the NGOs expect and want from the government is a conducive environment where they can work without fear or without any sort of restraint. Now, as far as the state is concerned, so state's interest is basically in keeping itself uh, abreast of whatever the NGOs are doing. So, for example, if the state wants to do some sort of policy planning in education or health sectors, so it needs to know which areas and which groups of populations are already being served through various interventions of NGOs. So, to be able to uh, allow the NGOs and the state services in, for example, education and health to complement each other, it is important that the state in the first instance knows what is being done by the NGOs. So the first requirement of the state as far as its relationship with NGOs is concerned is that of information. So it needs information that how many NGOs are working, what are their areas of operation, geographically as well as sectorally, what are their sources of funding, and what are the types of services that they are providing. And the second interest of the state is to ensure that NGOs uh, support rather than undermine state's broad policy objectives. So, if, for example, if we are talking about, let's say, education sector, so state's interest is in promoting and supporting those type of NGO activities uh, which support state's objective of providing a particular type of education which allows students to think clearly and to articulate themselves freely. So, if certain NGOs are found to be imparting a particular type of education which closes their minds, which rather than promoting critical thinking, which inhibits free and critical thinking, so state's interest then lies in through its regulatory mechanism, state's interest lies in discouraging or even prohibiting these NGOs from doing those activities which undermine state's policy objectives. So that is the second objective that the state has. And the third objective is that, in modern times, as our uh, governance, not only in the public sector but also in the private sector, gets more and more globalized. So several of our NGOs are no longer local players. So they are now integrated into a network of international NGOs. They are integrated into. They are able to access international financing. So it is important for the state as the sovereign in this part of the world to know with a with a good degree of certainty the sources of funding of various NGOs and how these funds are being utilized. So I think these are, as far as the NGOs are concerned. So I think I have clearly listed two areas where the NGOs need to interact with the state, and I have, I think, identified three areas in which the state needs to interact with the NGOs. So I think the biggest challenge is the state thinking itself, because the state is not ready to accept NGOs as equal partners in its pursuit of uh, social development. So the state considers NGOs to be peripheral, and especially when it comes to rights-based NGOs, because by definition the rights-based NGOs throughout the world are confrontational. So they raise their voice, they highlight those issues, they identify those issues where the rights of citizens have been violated, and the rights of these citizens could be violated by individuals, by powerful individuals, or by powerful state actors. So that is one area where the state doesn't want the NGOs to operate freely. So I think the biggest impediment as far as the state NGO interaction is concerned, and as far as addressing some of the uh, ambivalent relationship between the state and NGO that I talk about in detail in my paper. So in my personal view, so it's state's reluctance to engage with NGOs at a level of equality. State either tends to ignore these NGOs or tends to think of them as organizations which are foreign funded, which are hostile, which are pursuing some other agenda. That if the NGOs are hostile, so it is not necessary that their hostility is bad for the state itself. So their hostility is actually important for improvement in the working of the government, in exactly the same sense in which a free and fair media is important for improving the working of the government. Because if we have a free civil society which can speak its mind, which can raise the issues of rights violations uh, without fear of reprisal, so then the chances of citizens' rights being protected are substantially larger than would be the case if the state tries to muzzle the voice of these NGOs and the voice of the free media. So, although in the short run it may appear that there is a tension between the what the state is trying to pursue and what the rights-based NGOs, for example, are trying to pursue, but in actuality there is no tension, because the long-term interest of the state is also served if if its activities are subjected to a fair critique, and if there are independent groups, if there are independent organizations which can raise their voices whenever there is a violation of a right. And that violation of a right could be anything, including the right of people to, let's say, free education, or the right of people to free healthcare. So I think state has to learn to uh, uh, engage with the NGOs on a more uh, equal footing. So that's a tricky question, because there are no uh, ways of assessing the impact of something as humble as a research paper. So one way of assessing the impact of a publication is to look at, for example, the number of citations. So I don't think this paper has received very many citations, and the citations so far should be, well, less than a dozen, I think. And that's not unusual. So that's very typical of a paper. So other than those papers who become very famous, most papers are cited by only a few people. So that's one level of impact. Another way of assessing the impact of a research paper is to find out or to try to identify the courses where this paper is being taught. So I think there it has greater success, because this paper is being taught by another instructor in this very school in a level 300 course. So that means that in every semester, 50-60 students get to read that, get to discuss this paper, get to critique it, and so the chances of them being impacted by the discussion in that are to that extent larger. Another way of assessing the impact of a paper is the contribution it has made to my own thought process, and I think that has been substantial. So I learned several things while I was working on this paper, and I find that to be useful intellectual development. I got to read several things, I carried out several interviews, talked to several NGOs. I looked at some of my own practices uh, from the days when I was working with these NGOs critically, and so um, that contributed to my own intellectual development. So I think these are some of the ways in which the impact of this research paper can be assessed. So it has not been great, but it has not been inconsequential altogether.